The Royal Affliction. The kingdom of Korashan was not built for quiet suffering, it was built for fire. Every stone in its palace had been quarried from the volcanic ridges of the Emberspine Mountains, hauled by Dragonclaw and set into place by builders who worked in thick leather, and prayed the molten veins running through the rock would hold long enough for the mortar to cure. The towers rose in jagged, asymmetric spires not for beauty, but because dragon architects had little patience for human notions of symmetry, and because the occasional eruption from the mountain below required structures that could flex and settle rather than shatter cleanly. The corridors were wide enough to accommodate a wingspan. The ceilings soared 30 feet in the main halls and twice that in the royal chambers. The floors were polished obsidian, cool underfoot, reflecting the perpetual amber glow of the torch sconces that burned day and night with fire oil harvested from deep earth wells. It was a kingdom that announced itself in the bones. Walk through its gates and you felt the heat first, not unpleasant, not scalding, just present, like standing near a forge that never went entirely cold. You felt your own smallness second. And third, if you were paying attention, you felt the weight of centuries. The accumulation of a civilization so old it had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone, and had settled into the particular confidence of a people who knew, without arrogance, that they had outlasted everything that had ever tried to threaten them. It was not a kingdom accustomed to helplessness. Princess Vaelithra of the Embercrown lineage had not slept in 11 days. That was not entirely accurate, she could not sleep. The distinction mattered, though no one in the royal household had the courage to make it to her face. Could not imply an external cause, a thing done to her rather than a failing of her own body. Could not was survivable, could be fixed. But fixed by whom and how had become the pressing and increasingly desperate question consuming every healer, physician, and scholar the Embercrown court possessed. The affliction had begun without warning or apparent cause. One morning Vaelithra had risen from her rest looking unchanged, her scales holding their deep iridescent blue-black luster, her eyes bright and gold as newly minted coin, her movements carrying the fluid, unhurried precision of a creature who had never once doubted her own body's obedience. She had eaten breakfast. She had attended the morning court. She had reviewed the border reports from the eastern provinces with her usual exacting attention, flagging 3 inconsistencies in the patrol rotations that her senior generals had missed. That night something had changed. The trembling began at the base of her tail, a fine, persistent vibration like a plucked bowstring that could not find its way to silence. It crawled upward through 600 pounds of iridescent blue-black scales, traveling the long architecture of her spine, branching into her wings where it set the great membranes shivering against their own weight, climbing her neck to rattle her teeth together in a soft, involuntary chattering she would have found humiliating had anyone been present to witness it. Her ember glands, the paired organs nestled deep in her chest that fed her fire, guttered and flared with the incoherence of candles in a draft, cycling between too cold and too bright, producing no usable heat, only an uncomfortable cycling sensation that she could feel in the walls of her ribcage like a second, a rhythmic heartbeat. She had lain awake until the false dawn, willing the sensation to resolve. It did not. By the third day, the Embercrown court was in a state of restrained but pervasive panic. Dragons did not get sick in ways that could not be identified and corrected. There were dragon ailments, well documented, scale rot, which afflicted the elderly and was treatable with mineral baths, ember fever, which occasionally struck the young when their fire glands were still developing, the peculiar seasonal complaint called drift sorrow, which certain dragons experienced during the deep winter when the thermals changed and had more to do with the spirit than the body. But those were known things, named things. Vaelithra's affliction resisted numbing. It had no precedent in the royal physician's considerable records. It presented no visible symptoms beyond the sleeplessness itself. Her scales were unblemished, her appetite remained, though she ate mechanically without pleasure, her reflexes sharp, her cognition unimpaired. She was, by every diagnostic measure available, in perfect health. She was also shaking, sleepless, and growing quieter in a way that frightened her household more than shouting would have. The first physician was a Korashan elder named Voruk, who had practiced dragon medicine for 80 years and held more honorary titles than could be comfortably listed in a single breath. He arrived with his diagnostic instruments, a set of resonance rods that could detect disruptions in a dragon's internal fire current, a series of specialized crystal lenses for examining scale health at depth, and several decades of formidable professional confidence. He examined Vaelithra for the better part of a morning, humming to himself, making notes on fireproof parchment in a hand so cramped and archaic that his apprentices could barely read it. At the end of his examination, he declared that the princess suffered from an imbalance of her inner fire current, likely caused by overexertion of her ember glands during the autumn flame season, and prescribed a course of mineral-rich broth and reduced activity. Vaelithra followed his prescription for 3 days. She did not sleep. The second physician arrived from the Western Reach, a specialist in conditions affecting high-lineage dragons, those whose bloodlines had grown particularly potent over generations and sometimes produced unusual complications as a result. Her name was Saravith, and she was younger than Vorok, sharper in her methods and considerably more invasive in her examination. She took blood samples. She pressed resonance crystals to 7 points along Valithra's spine and measured the return frequencies with equipment that had to be assembled on-site and took 4 hours to calibrate. She reviewed the notes Vorok had left, dismissed most of them with a politely neutral expression, and then declared that the princess was suffering from a condition she called lineage resonance fatigue, caused by the increasing potency of the Emberkron bloodline creating a kind of internal dissonance in the nervous system that disrupted sleep patterns. She prescribed an elaborate regimen of exercises designed to harmonize the resonance pathways, and a preparation of rare minerals dissolved in flame-blessed water that had to be sourced from 3 separate volcanoes, and took 2 weeks to prepare. They had the preparation ready by day 9. Valithra drank it, she did not sleep. The dwarven alchemist came next, not because anyone expected a dwarf to understand dragon medicine better than the dragon physicians, but because desperation had broadened the search considerably. His name was Brekka Irondeep, and he had crossed the Deepforge Mountains with a cart full of alchemical apparatus and the kind of deep professional pride that made him impossible to dismiss even when his methods were incomprehensible to everyone watching. He spent 2 full days in the palace laboratory, brewing a preparation from powdered moonstone, dried worm bile, black volcanic salt, and a dozen other components he declined to name, working in complete silence with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely believed he was going to solve this where others had failed. He was not wrong about his own competence. The preparation he produced was, by any objective measure, a masterwork of alchemical craft, stable, potent, precisely formulated. He presented it to Valithra with quiet dignity and watched her drink it with an expression of careful professional expectation. On the morning of the 11th day, Brekka packed his apparatus into his cart without a word and departed before breakfast. He left a note suggesting consultation with an elven healer, which read less like a recommendation and more like a man gracefully acknowledging the boundaries of his domain. The elven healer came the same afternoon. Her name was Arundel, and she was, in the way of certain elves, so composedly certain of her own perceptions that confidence and arrogance became difficult to distinguish. She declined the diagnostic instruments. She declined the medical records. She pressed her long, pale fingers to Valithra's temples. Valithra submitted to this with the expression of someone making a significant personal sacrifice, and was still for a long time, eyes closed, face arranged in an expression of deep spiritual receptivity. When she opened her eyes, she said, a spiritual malaise born of pride. The room was very quiet. I beg your pardon, Valithra said, in a tone that did not beg anything. Arundel explained, with the untroubled patience of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome truths, that the affliction was not physical in origin but spiritual, a consequence of carrying the Emberkron lineage's considerable pride without adequate humility to balance it, resulting in a kind of spiritual congestion that disrupted the body's capacity for rest. She prescribed meditation, a reduction in formal court duties, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than attempting to resolve it through action. Valithra listened to this in complete silence. When Arundel finished, the princess thanked her for her time, and then, after she had left the room, scorched the chair Arundel had been sitting into a neat pile of ash without any particular change in expression. The court wizard was the last and least inspiring attempt. His name was Tolis, and he was a perfectly capable wizard whose confidence had been badly damaged by watching 4 consecutive experts fail to solve a problem that everyone had assumed would be simple. He cast 17 different diagnostic enchantments over the course of an afternoon, cross-referenced the results against 3 separate magical taxonomies of ailment, and arrived at his conclusion with the subdued energy of a man who had already half-stopped believing it himself. The princess, he said, is very unwell. Yes, said the senior chamberlain who had been standing in the corner for 6 hours. That is why you are here. The enchantments confirm it, Tola said, somewhat defensively. After that, a particular silence fell over the palace. Not the silence of peace or resolution, but the silence of exhausted imagination, of a household that had tried every tool it possessed and arrived at the same impassive wall. The physicians compared notes and found no convergence. The alchemist's departure left a gap that no one moved to fill. The court fell into the particular uncertainty of people who are very good at following established procedures, and have just discovered that none of the established procedures apply. Valithra herself had grown quieter, not weaker, that was important, and her household noticed it with a mixture of relief and increased unease. Her mind remained precise. Her decisions when required of her were sound. She had not, as some had privately feared, begun to deteriorate in any visible way. But she had pulled inward, wings folded tighter, eyes cast more often toward the windows and the distant mountains, as though searching for something the interior of the palace could not provide. She spoke less at meals. She dismissed her attendants earlier each evening. She sat sometimes in the long hours before dawn in a stillness that was not peaceful but exhausted, the ember glow in her eyes cycling slow and low, watching the dark with the particular patience of someone who has stopped expecting it to change. She did not complain. That, more than anything, frightened the people who knew her. Valithra had never in her life been reluctant to voice dissatisfaction. The absence of complaint meant something had progressed past the point where complaint felt useful. It was Tamaz who noticed first that she was not merely suffering but searching. Tamaz Reyes was 23 years old, human, and had arrived at the Korashan Palace 6 months prior as part of the diplomatic exchange program between the Dragon Kingdom and the Human Conclave. One of those programs whose stated purpose was cultural enrichment, and whose practical effect was to place a series of carefully selected young people in mildly uncomfortable situations and see what they made of themselves. He had been assigned as Valithra's personal chamber servant, which carried considerably more ceremony than substance. His duties were to ensure the torch sconces were filled and lit, to replace the fireproof tapestries when Valithra scorched them in her sleep, which had been a regular occurrence before the affliction began and had now stopped. He realized, because she was no longer sleeping deeply enough to dream flame, to manage the morning delivery of the enormous quantities of raw elk she preferred for breakfast, and to maintain the general order of a chamber built on a scale that made him feel, every morning he entered it, like a beetle who had wandered into a cathedral. He was not a healer. He held no qualifications in medicine, alchemy, magic, or any of the other disciplines that had been brought to bear on Valithra's condition. He spoke the dragon tongue with an accent that the palace guards found charming in the way that people find small animals charming, endearing, not entirely serious, producing in listeners a small unconscious softening that they would have denied if asked. He was, by every formal measure of the royal household, the least important person connected to this situation. Servants were not consulted on medical matters. Servants were not expected to have useful observations about conditions that had defeated the kingdom's finest physicians. Servants were expected to keep the torches lit and be invisible when not specifically needed. Tamaz had grown up the fourth of 8 children in a house where resources were sufficient, but not lavish, and attention was the true scarcity. His mother was a practical woman of considerable intelligence who had long ago developed the philosophy that most problems, before they were anything else, were spatial, located somewhere specific, caused by something that occupied physical space, solvable by someone willing to look carefully at where the problem actually lived rather than where it was assumed to live. She had applied this philosophy to everything, from the mysterious smell in the cellar, a dead mouse behind the water barrel, to his youngest sister's chronic night terrors, a loose shutter that caught the wind at low tide and produced, at certain angles, a sound indistinguishable from a low, distant moaning. She had, when Tamaz was young and sick with a fever that 3 physicians had attributed to 3 different causes, done something none of them had done. She had gone to his room and looked around it carefully. She had found, eventually, a damp patch of wall behind his headboard where black mold had grown undetected behind a tapestry, seeping its slow, invisible damage into the air he breathed every night. The tapestry came down. The wall was treated. The fever broke within a week. The physicians, to their credit, had all agreed this was the cause after the fact. None of them had thought to check. This lesson, that the room was part of the patient, that the environment was as much a subject of diagnosis as the body it contained, had settled into Tamaz's understanding so deeply that it had become instinct. He applied it to his chamber duties almost without thinking. When the torch sconces flickered, he checked the fire oil supply and the draft patterns before assuming anything was wrong with the sconces. When the tapestries deteriorated faster than expected, he looked for heat sources he hadn't mapped before blamming the tapestry material. He was, in the language of his profession, a thorough keeper of rooms. He had watched the physicians come and go. He had watched Vorak with his resonance rods, Saravith with her crystal instruments, the alchemist with his brews, the healer with her closed eyes and open pronouncements. He had stood at the periphery of each examination, doing his job, staying invisible, and noticing the shape of each approach with the particular attention of someone who has nothing at stake professionally, and can therefore observe without the distortion of investment. None of them had looked at the room. They had all looked at Valithra, her blood, her spine, her fire current, her resonance patterns, her spiritual condition. Every instrument, every method, every conclusion had been directed at the princess herself, at the interior mechanisms of a body that was, as far as Tamaz could observe, continuing to function. They had stood in the chamber, examined the patient at its center, and then departed, and none of them, as far as Tamaz could determine from his position at the edges, had looked under the bed. He almost hadn't either. The thought had arrived slowly, the way thoughts that feel obvious after the fact usually do, not as an insight but as a quiet nagging question, the kind that persists not because it is dramatic but because it refuses to be answered by anything else. He had been replacing the fire oil in the easternmost sconce on the morning of the 11th day, standing on the small movable platform he used to reach the high fixtures, when the question had finally organized itself into words clear enough to act on. Has anyone looked under the beds? He had stood on the platform for a moment with the oil flask in his hand, running through his memory of the examinations he had witnessed. Vorok's resonance rods had been applied to Valithra's body. Saravith's crystals had been applied to Valithra's spine. The alchemist had worked in the laboratory, not the chamber. The healer had never left the center of the room. The wizard had stood at various points around the room's perimeter and directed his enchantments inward toward the princess. Nobody had gotten on their hands and knees and looked at what was beneath the largest piece of furniture in the room. Tamaz came down from the platform. He replaced the oil flask in his kit. He stood in the middle of the chamber for a moment, looking at the great obsidian bed frame with its volcanic stone platform, and thought about what his mother would do. His mother would look. He would need a lantern. The space under the bed was deep shadow. The frame rose nearly 4 feet from the floor, enormous by human standards, modest relative to Valithra's size, and the gap beneath it was wide and dark and had, as far as Tamaz could determine, never been part of anyone's diagnostic consideration. He went to his supply kit, retrieved the small hand lantern he kept for maintenance work in the unlit passages behind the chamber walls, and struck the flint. Then he went back to the bed, and he got down on his knees and he looked. It took some courage to approach the princess. Not the loud, performative courage of soldiers marching into battle with their chests out and their banners flying. That kind required an audience and fed on momentum. This was the quieter, less celebrated variety. The courage of knowing something might go badly and doing it anyway because the alternative was standing still and doing nothing, which felt worse. It was the courage of a man who had weighed his options in the 30 seconds it took him to walk from the supply kit to the chamber door, and had concluded without great drama that someone needed to check under the bed, and he was the only person in the palace who had thought to do it. Valithra was, on her best days, formidable. That was perhaps an understatement in the way that calling the Emberspine Mountains moderately elevated terrain was an understatement, technically defensible, practically misleading, missing the essential quality of the thing entirely. She was formidable the way a forge was formidable, the way a volcanic caldera was formidable, not through aggression or theatrics, but through the simple fact of what she was and what she was capable of, both present in every motion, in the particular quality of stillness she maintained when she was not moving, in the way the air in a room she occupied felt subtly different from air in rooms she did not. She had crushed stone with her bare hands at her coming-of-age ceremony. She had breathed fire since she was 3 years old. She had reviewed border patrol reports with more precision than her senior generals and caught inconsistencies that had slipped past 3 tiers of oversight. All of this was simply who Valithra was, as unremarkable to her as breathing was to anyone else. On her 11th sleepless day, she was something both less and worse than formidable. Her scales had lost their luster, not dramatically, not in the way of illness in stories, where suffering always announces itself in obvious and picturesque ways, but in the subtle, deflating manner of a gemstone taken from good light and placed in dim. The iridescent blue-black that usually caught torchlight and returned it, enriched, had gone flat matte, producing no depth. Her eyes, which in full health burned with a fierce and steady gold, had shifted to a low amber, not dimmed exactly but banked like embers that had been left untended for too long and were maintaining heat through stubbornness rather than fuel. Her posture, usually carrying that fluid, unhurried precision, had contracted, wings pulled close, tail curled tight, the posture of something conserving itself. And beneath the conservation, barely contained, was the fury. Not explosive fury. Valithra was too controlled for that, and too proud and too exhausted. It was the quieter, more dangerous kind, the fury of someone who was deeply accustomed to competence in herself and in the world around her, and had been confronted for 11 consecutive days with a problem that resisted every competent intervention. The physicians had failed. The alchemist had failed. The healer had failed, and had also, with impressive lack of self-preservation instinct, suggested the problem was spiritual in nature and rooted in pride, a diagnosis that had earned her exit from the room and the immolation of the chair she had occupied. The wizard had failed so comprehensively that his conclusion had amounted to confirming the existence of a problem that everyone already knew existed, which was not a conclusion so much as a decorated restatement of the original question. 11 days, every resource the kingdom possessed brought to bear on a single problem, and the problem remained. The fury was there in the set of her jaw, in the way the ember glow in her eyes pulsed with an irregular rhythm that anyone who knew dragons would recognize as the physiological signal of controlled but active agitation. It was there in the quality of her silence, which had texture to it, the texture of a person actively working to maintain a surface they would very much prefer to abandon. She had already that morning singed the eyebrows off Arundel the elven healer, not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately, in the way that things done in moments of insufficient self-control can be simultaneously intentional and unintentional, depending on which part of the actor you asked. The healer had made one final attempt to suggest that meditation might bring relief, and Valithra's ember glands had expressed an opinion before the rest of her had quite decided to. The eyebrows had gone. Arundel had departed with tremendous dignity and slightly less face than she had arrived with. The mahogany chair had been purely circumstantial. It had been nearby. Valithra had needed something to do with the tension in her jaw that morning at around the 4th hour of unwanted wakefulness, and the chair had been the nearest available object that could be destroyed without meaningful consequence. The biting had been, by the accounts of the 2 attendants who witnessed it, extremely efficient. The chair had not survived the first attempt. Valithra had regarded the wreckage for a moment, then returned to staring at the window, which was made of volcanic glass and was therefore considerably more resistant to stress-related destruction. This was the room and the creature that Tamaz walked toward. He had knocked twice at the chamber door, the standard signal that announced his entry, usually answered by a wave of acknowledgement or a direction to come in, or on one memorable early occasion, a jet of flame that had been aimed well past him but had still made his subsequent entry somewhat cautious. This morning there was nothing. No acknowledgement, no direction, no warning shot. Just silence, thick and loaded, from the far end of the vast chamber where the bed platform rose against the eastern wall. He entered anyway. It was his job to enter. His job did not include a provision for suspending entry based on atmospheric assessment of the occupant's emotional state, and even if it had, suspension would have meant not checking under the bed, and the lantern was already lit and clipped to his belt, warm against his hip, and the question, "Has anyone looked?" was still sitting in the front of his mind where it had been sitting since he came down from the platform, patient and persistent as a creditor. "Get out," Valithra said. She did not look up. She was sitting at the edge of the bed platform, a posture that struck Tamaz even in this moment as unusual. She typically rested in the center, sprawled in the full span of the space, with her wings drawn in and her head lowered, not in submission but in the specific attitude of a creature that has been maintaining itself under considerable strain and has begun to economize. She looked, he thought, profoundly tired in a way that went beyond the merely physical. Tired in the way of someone who has not given up, but is approaching the geography of giving up and recognizing its features. "I will, Your Highness," Tamaz said. "I just need to check something first." He was already moving, not quickly, not in the aggressive way that might read as challenge, but with the steady, purposeful unhurriedness of someone who is doing a specific task and intends to complete it. He had learned in 6 months of serving a dragon that manner mattered considerably more than words. What you did with your body in the space around a dragon communicated faster and more accurately than anything your mouth produced. He moved the way he moved when he was maintaining the chamber, with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged in the room and had a reason for what he was doing. Valithra watched him cross the floor. She did not stop him, which he chose to read as permission rather than distraction. The bed platform rose before him, enormous, its volcanic stone base smooth from decades of contact with enormous scaled weight. The frame of black iron above it was cold to the touch. He had learned early not to touch it without checking first, because in the mornings after Valithra had dream-flamed in her sleep, the iron could hold heat for hours. This morning it was cold. It had been cold for 11 mornings now, because she had not dream-flamed, because she had not dreamed, because she had not slept. He went to his knees on the obsidian floor. The cold of it came through his breeches immediately, a reminder that the palace maintained its volcanic warmth in the walls and the air but not the floors, which were designed to counterbalance the ambient heat and would never be confused with comfortable. He unclipped the lantern from his belt, held it ahead of him, and looked into the space beneath the bed platform. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. The web was unlike anything he had encountered in the human settlements of the Conclave's territory, not the loose, irregular constructions of common house spiders, but a dense architectural structure of almost geometric precision, anchored at intervals to the stone base of the platform and to the floor beneath, creating a layered arrangement that caught his lantern light and fractured it into 100 small silver reflections. The spiders themselves were small and pale, nearly translucent, scattered through the web in clusters at the anchor points, motionless in the lantern light in the way that small creatures go motionless when exposed, waiting for the disruption to pass. There were dozens of them, possibly more than dozens. He had read about them, or rather, he had read about something matching this description in one of the Conclave's natural history records, included in the collection of documentation sent with the exchange program participants as reference material for conditions unique to the stone-built structures of the older kingdoms. Thornweb spiders. He hadn't thought much about the entry at the time. He thought about it now. He pulled his head back from under the bed. He stayed on his knees for a moment, working through what he knew and what it meant and how to say it, aware that what he was about to deliver was not good news delivered in the normal way, not medical news. Not the news of a treatable condition requiring a complex intervention, but the specific, quietly explosive variety of news that recontextualizes everything that has come before it. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "did you know there is a thornweb nest under your bed?" The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. Not empty, filled rather, with the processing of a mind that was very quick and very tired encountering a piece of information that didn't fit any of the categories it had been sorting information into for 11 days. "Then a what?" "Thornweb spiders, Your Highness." He kept his voice even informational, the tone he used when explaining a maintenance issue, matter of fact, not alarmed, because alarm was not useful and the information was enough on its own without the addition of his emotional response to it. "They're not dangerous to dragons, to your biology, I mean. They don't bite, they don't produce venom, they don't damage the structure of a building. The Conclave has records of them. They infest old stone buildings, volcanic stone particularly, because the mineral content of the stone resembles the cave formations they prefer in nature." He paused, organizing. "The web they spin vibrates continuously, at a very specific frequency, almost inaudible, right at the edge of what hearing can detect. It's mechanical, not a sound so much as a resonance. They use it to communicate, to coordinate the colony. The Conclave's records describe it as similar to the feeling of standing on a bridge that a large cart is crossing. That low, persistent vibration through the soles of your feet." He watched her. Her head had come up slowly during this explanation, the amber glow of her eyes finding him, fixing on him with an attention that was suddenly and completely present in a way it had not been when he entered the room. "The vibration doesn't harm anyone," he continued, "but it prevents deep sleep. The nervous system interprets it as a threat signal, not loudly, not urgently, it doesn't wake you exactly. It keeps the body in a state of low alertness, just enough to interrupt the deepest stage of sleep before it completes. You'd feel it through the stone." A pause. "Through your scales, probably all along the underside, like a low, persistent trembling that you couldn't quite locate or resolve." The silence after this was longer, much longer. The emberglow in her eyes did something he hadn't seen before, shifted, not in color exactly but in quality, the banked amber deepening and then brightening, and then settling into something that was neither the exhausted low of the past 11 days nor the fierce gold of full health, but something between, something that had the particular heat of a feeling being very carefully managed. "11 days, Valithra said very quietly. "Yes, Your Highnesses." The words had almost nothing in them. No inflection of accusation, no dramatic weight, just the number and the acknowledgement. But the weight was there anyway, in the quality of the quiet that surrounded them, in everything that 11 days contained, all the examinations and prescriptions and preparations and pronouncements, and the elven healer's eyebrows and the mahogany chair and the long hours before dawn watching a window that offered no resolution. 11 days of physicians, she said, still quiet, still utterly controlled, which was, Tamaz reflected, more frightening than shouting would have been. 11 days of healers and alchemists and a wizard who made me drink something that tasted like the bottom of a swamp at low tide. "Yes, Your Highnesses." And the answer was under my bed. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a mind arriving at a conclusion it had not yet fully decided what to do with, working through the implications of a simple fact that had somehow, through 11 days of escalating expertise and increasingly elaborate intervention, been entirely overlooked by every credentialed professional who had stood in this room. "A small pale spider," she said, with a precision that suggested she was choosing each word very deliberately. "Not dangerous, not venom, not malice. A spider building a web in old stone, as spiders do, producing a vibration that." She stopped, the emberglow pulsed once deeply. Tamaz did not fill the silence. He had learned in 6 months that there were silences it was wise to leave alone and silences it was useful to address, and this was distinctly the former. He was still kneeling on the cold floor. He had not moved since finishing his explanation. He held the lantern in one hand, its light steady, casting his shadow long and thin across the obsidian. Her eyes shifted to him with a directness that he felt physically, the full, undivided attention of a creature whose attention, when it was complete, had genuine weight. "You are a servant," she said, not unkindly, precisely. "You carry firewood, you bring elk, you replace the tapestries when a fractional pause, when they require replacing." "I do, Your Highness." "You are not a physician. You hold no qualifications in medicine, resonance theory, elemental alchemy, or any discipline that was brought to bear on this problem. No, your highnesses. And yet you are the person kneeling on my floor with a lantern, having just located in 30 seconds what 11 days of the kingdom's finest expertise could not. He considered how to answer this honestly without either false modesty, which would be inaccurate and she would likely find insulting, or something that sounded like self-congratulation, which would be both premature and unwise in the current atmospheric conditions. Why did you look under the bed, she said, when no one else did? It was not precisely the kind of question he had prepared for. He had prepared, loosely, in the few seconds between deciding to do this and actually doing it, for a version of this conversation that involved more immediate hostility and less of this careful, focused inquiry. He had not prepared for her to be still and genuinely curious, in the way that someone is genuinely curious when they have encountered a thing that does not fit their existing categories and are choosing to understand it rather than dismiss it. He thought about the question honestly. My mother, he said, always said that when something is wrong and you don't know why, you start with the simplest thing first. Check the room before you check the person. The problem is somewhere, it lives somewhere, it takes up space somewhere. Before you look at everything complicated and internal and difficult to access, you look at the space. You look at what's actually there. He shifted slightly on his knees, the cold floor was making itself known and then settled again. The physicians knew a great deal about dragons, more than I will ever know. They understood your biology, your fire current, your resonance patterns, your lineage. They looked at all of those things very carefully and with very good instruments and very deep expertise. A pause. I just knew the room. He watched her take this in. You knew the room, she repeated slowly. I've been maintaining this chamber for 6 months, Your Highness. I know which sconces draft in the east wind. I know how long the tapestries last before the ambient heat degrades the thread. I know the floor temperature varies by 3 degrees between the north wall and the south. He glanced briefly toward the bed platform. I know the space beneath the bed frame has never in 6 months been part of any routine maintenance check, because it was assumed to be unimportant. Because it was dark and large and not immediately relevant to any task anyone was performing, he looked back at her. It was relevant to this one. The ember glow in her eyes had changed again. It had settled into something steadier, something that burned with more consistent heat than he had seen in it since before the affliction began, not yet the full fierce gold of her at full health, but warming toward it, the way a fire builds from its own increasing warmth once the initial work of lighting has been done. Get off the cold floor, she said after a long moment. You've been kneeling since you opened the lantern, and the stone in this chamber in the mornings is not forgiving. He stood, and as he did, she rose from the edge of the bed platform, rose to her full height for what felt, in the quality of the movement, like the first time in 11 days that the rising was not an act of sheer stubborn will held together with exhaustion. Not full strength. Not yet. But the beginning of full strength, visible in the way potential is visible before it becomes actual. As a kind of readiness, a gathering. The nest, she said, can it be relocated without harming them? He blinked. He had not quite anticipated this question, though in retrospect it was entirely consistent with everything he had observed about her. Yes, Your Highness, they have no particular attachment to location, only to the mineral composition of the stone. Any old stone wall in a dark corner would serve them as well. The far garden wall would do, its volcanic granite and largely undisturbed. Then relocate them, she said, without harm. Yes, Your Highness. She looked at him for a moment longer, that same full, present attention, steady and assessing in a way that was not unfriendly but was completely without softness. The look of a person taking accurate measure of something and deciding what the accurate measure means. Your name, she said, remind me. Tamaz, Your Highness, Tamaz Rays. Tamaz Rays, she repeated, with the precision of someone committing a thing to memory not as a social courtesy but as a practical act. You may go. Come back with whatever is needed to relocate the nest. Yes, Your Highness. He collected his supply kit. He clipped the lantern back to his belt. He walked back across the vast obsidian floor toward the chamber door, aware of her eyes on his back the entire length of the crossing, and aware also, in the particular, quiet, skin-level way that certain moments announce their own significance, that something had just shifted in the architecture of this household in a way that would not shift back. Behind him, he heard her move to the window. He heard the deliberate, slow exhale of someone practicing restraint with the focused intention of a person who has decided, very specifically, to remain calm. And then, just before he reached the door, he heard something he had not heard from Vaelithra in 11 days, in 6 months, in all his time in Korashan. A single, short, entirely undignified sound that was, unmistakably, the beginning of a laugh caught, controlled, suppressed before it could fully form, but present. Undeniably present. The sound of someone who has just understood the full absurdity of a situation and found, somewhere beneath 11 days of exhausted fury, the capacity to recognize it. Tamaz opened the door, he stepped through it, he closed it behind him. He stood for a moment in the corridor, the lantern warm at his hip, the clay jar he would need for the spiders already forming in his mind, the route to the garden wall already mapping itself. Then he went to collect the jar and he got to work. What was remembered? The nest was removed by morning. It did not take long. Thornweb spiders were, as Tamaz had told the princess, creatures of preference rather than attachment. They wanted darkness and old stone and the particular mineral composition of volcanic rock, and they had no sentimental relationship with any specific location that provided these things. One dark wall was to a thornweb spider functionally identical to another dark wall. They did not grieve displacement. They did not resist it. When Tamaz returned to the chamber in the last hour before dawn with a wide-mouthed clay jar sealed with a ventilated cork and a flat piece of smooth stone to serve as a sweep, they went into the jar with the calm indifference of creatures who had already identified a suitable alternative and were simply waiting to be taken there. He worked carefully. He was aware, in the way he was aware of most things in this chamber, of the quality of the silence at the far end of the room of the princess's presence, not watching him exactly, but not entirely removed from awareness of what was happening at the base of her bed platform either. He worked without speaking. The lantern was low and steady. The spiders moved into the jar in clusters, following the pheromone trails of the first few that went in, their translucent bodies catching the light in brief silver flickers before the darkness of the jar swallowed them. He counted approximately as he worked. There were more than he had estimated from his first look, not dozens but scores. A colony that had been establishing itself in the mineral-rich volcanic stone of the platform base for what must have been months, possibly longer, building its precise geometric architecture in the one space in the palace that nobody had examined. He thought about that as he swept, about how long the nest might have been there before the affliction began, about whether it had grown to a critical mass before the vibration reached the threshold that disrupted sleep, about whether there had been earlier, subtler effects that had been attributed to other causes or simply absorbed into the background of a body's ordinary complaints and overlooked. He thought, how many things are like this? How many problems had roots in a dark corner that nobody had checked, not out of negligence, but out of the simple, reasonable assumption that the dark corners were unimportant. He sealed the jar when the last cluster of spiders had been coaxed inside. He checked the space under the bed with the lantern once more, thoroughly, going from one end of the platform base to the other, looking for satellite constructions, secondary anchor points, any evidence of a second colony that might have established itself elsewhere in the chamber. There was nothing. The stone was clean. The web structures, severed from their anchors when he swept, hung loose and inert. He gathered those two, the collapsed geometry of them falling apart under the slightest touch, and deposited them in the jar. He stood, his knees registered the cold floor with a pointed but manageable complaint. He put the jar in his kit, capped his lantern to a low burn, and crossed the chamber toward the door. Tamaz. Her voice in the near dark was different than it was in daylight, lower, without the carrying resonance of a dragon in full wakefulness, but steady. Steadier than it had been in 11 days. Something in the quality of it had changed in the hours since their conversation. The sharp, fraying edge of controlled fury had gone. What remained was something more settled, still exhausted, but no longer fraying, the difference between a bowstring drawn to its limit and a bowstring at rest. He turned. She was in the center of the bed platform now, not at the edge. Wings not fully spread but no longer pressed tight to her body. Tail uncurled behind her, its tip resting on the volcanic stone with the loose, unself-conscious ease of a limb that had stopped bracing itself. The garden wall, she said. The south-facing section, the stone there is older, the mineral composition is denser, they will prefer it. He absorbed this. Yes, Your Highness, thank you. A pause that was not uncomfortable. Go, she said, not unkindly, and closed the door quietly. He went. He closed the door with the care of someone closing a door on something that needed to be undisturbed. He walked the long corridor from the royal chamber to the east stairwell, down 3 flights of volcanic stone steps, through the great hall empty at this hour except for 2 guards at the far door who watched him pass with the mild curiosity of people with nothing else to observe, and out through the small servants' entrance into the pre-dawn gray of the palace garden. The garden in this hour was a different world from the garden in daylight. The day garden was formal, maintained, its volcanic rock terraces arranged with the deliberate precision of a civilization that had decided, at some point, that it wished to demonstrate its relationship with nature was one of organization rather than submission. The night garden was older. The torches along the main path were burning low, their light not reaching the edges, and at the edges things grew in the way things grow when they are left alone. Not wild exactly, not uncultivated, but following their own logic rather than an imposed one. The south-facing garden wall was at the far end beyond the torchlight, a long stretch of ancient volcanic granite that had been part of the original palace construction 3 centuries before the current structure was built around it. It faced south and collected heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, which meant it was, in the pre-dawn cold, fractionally warmer than its surroundings. It was covered in the slow mineral growths that old volcanic stone accumulates, dark crusts of geological patience, the accumulated record of centuries of heating and cooling, and the slow chemistry of stone meeting air. Tamaz found a deep crevice in the wall's lower section, wide enough to accommodate the jar's mouth. He uncorked it slowly. He waited. The spiders came out without encouragement, flowing into the crevice with the fluid collective movement of a colony that had already, somehow in the darkness of the jar, conducted whatever assessment was needed and reached a consensus. Within a few minutes the jar was empty. Within a few minutes more, if he shone his lantern close to the crevice, he could see the first anchoring threads of new construction beginning, the preliminary geometry of a web that would, in a few days, be indistinguishable from the web that had grown beneath the bed, except that it was here, in old stone in a dark corner at the edge of a garden, where the vibration of it would trouble no one. He stood at the wall for a moment after corking the empty jar, in the pre-dawn quiet, with the lantern in his hand and the garden dark around him and the palace rising behind him, its volcanic stone walls still radiating the stored heat of the day. He thought about the physicians. He thought about Saravith's resonance crystals and Voruk's 80 years of practice and Brekka's masterwork preparation, and Arundel's spiritual diagnosis and Tolus's 17 enchantments. He thought about all the accumulated expertise that had been brought to bear in good faith on a problem that none of it had been equipped to see, not because the expertise was inadequate for its own domain, but because none of it had included the step of looking at the domain itself. Of asking what is actually in this room. He did not feel clever. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, standing in the garden in the early dark, because the temptation was there, the small, warm temptation of having done something that very accomplished people had not done, and allowing that fact to become something it wasn't. He had not solved a medical problem. He had not outthought a dragon physician with 80 years of practice, or out-alchemized a dwarven master, or out-healed an elven spiritual practitioner. He had done something different, something parallel, something that occupied a space those disciplines had not thought to examine because it had not appeared to be their space. He had looked at the room. His mother's voice very clear in the early dark. The problem is somewhere. It lives somewhere. Before you look inside the person, look at the space they're in. He corked the empty jar. He put it in his kit. He walked back through the garden toward the servants' entrance, and as he pushed through the door and into the warmth of the palace interior, the first gray light of real dawn was beginning to show at the tops of the eastern towers. That night, for the first time in 11 days, Princess Valithra slept. She slept in the way that only the genuinely exhausted can sleep, not the shallow, restless, surface-level sleep of a body refusing to fully commit, but the deep, absolute, foundational sleep of a creature whose nervous system had been straining for 11 days against a signal it interpreted as threat and had, in the signal's absence, simply and completely surrendered to rest. She slept from the early afternoon into the following morning, 14 hours of uninterrupted unconsciousness that her household, checking periodically at the chamber door with the cautious hopefulness of people who had been disappointed many times and were not yet ready to fully believe, greeted first with relief, then with increasing, barely suppressed joy. Her ember glands, freed from the disruption that had kept them cycling in anxious incoherence, ran through their full heat cycle twice during the night. The east wing of the palace became, over the course of several hours, a study in involuntary climate change. The night guards posted at the east corridor sweated through their armor and removed their heavier pieces as quietly as the armor's construction allowed. A chambermaid sent to check the temperature at the second hour came back fanning herself and reported that the corridor felt like standing inside a bread oven, which the senior chamberlain noted in the duty log as ambient thermal elevation consistent with princess in deep sleep cycle normal presentation. He wrote this with the careful handwriting of someone experiencing a profound and private relief and doing their best to record it professionally. She slept with her wings spread to their full span for the first time in 11 days, the great membranes no longer pressed close and braced but extended, relaxed, filling the enormous chamber with their reach. Her tail was uncurled and still, its tip not tucked tight against her body, but trailing loose across the volcanic stone platform in the unself-conscious sprawl of genuine rest. Her chest rose and fell in the long, steady, thunderous rhythms of deep sleep, each exhale carrying a brief, soft pulse of heat that kept the chamber temperature several degrees above the palace average and made the fireproof tapestries on the eastern wall billow slightly in the exhaled currents. She slept and the palace breathed differently while she did lighter. the particular tension of 11 days of collective anxiety releasing slowly, hour by hour, into the humid warmth of the East Wing. When she woke in the late morning of the following day, the first thing she did was lie still for a full 2 minutes, doing nothing. Just being awake in a body that had rested, feeling what that felt like, taking inventory of the difference between a self that has slept and a self that has not. The ember glow in her eyes when she opened them was gold again. Not the low, exhausted amber of 11 days attrition, but the full, clear, fierce gold of a healthy adult dragon in full function, burning steady and deep, and without the arrhythmic flutter that had characterized them through every failed examination and every failed remedy and every long pre-dawn hour of enforced wakefulness. She lay still for 2 minutes. Then she called for the senior chamberlain, who appeared with impressive speed for someone pretending not to have been hovering. "Send for Tomas Reyes," she said, "and then leave. He came expecting to be dismissed." This was not, he told himself as he walked the corridor from the servants' quarters to the royal chambers, an unreasonable expectation. It was, in fact, the historically defensible expectation, informed by the accumulated pattern of how these things tended to work when humans in subordinate positions became witnesses to moments that the powerful found exposing. He had been present for something humbling, not just the solution to the affliction, but the particular quality of that solution, its simplicity, the implication of what 11 days of elaborate failure meant when measured against a single morning of practical attention. He had seen Valithra at the edge of herself, exhausted and furious and diminished in ways she would not have permitted an audience for if she had any choice. People in power, in his experience, had a complicated relationship with witnesses to their diminishment. Some were generous about it, some were not. The generous ones tended to remember what they owed and find ways to honor it. The others tended to find ways to reduce the witness until the witness was small enough that what they had seen no longer felt threatening. He had his bags half mentally packed. Not fully, not with any certainty that the packing would be necessary, but with the preparation of someone who had made peace with a range of possible outcomes and was not going to be caught entirely off guard by any of them. He knocked, he entered. He stood in the center of the obsidian floor in the morning light that came through the volcanic glass windows and lay across the chamber in long amber bars, and he looked at Valithra. She was sitting fully upright on the bed platform, and the difference between this and every time he had seen her in the past 11 days was physical, immediate, undeniable. Her scales had their luster back, not gradually, not partially, but completely, the iridescent blue-black running through its full spectrum as the morning light touched them, throwing color into the air around her in small, shifting fractals. Her posture carried that fluid, precise quality again, that unhurried certainty of a body that trusts itself completely. Her wings were folded but not braced. Her tail was arranged with the careless elegance of a creature at ease. And her eyes were gold, fully, fiercely, completely gold. He met them, and the meeting was different than it had been in every previous version of this interaction. Not the low amber of exhaustion, not the pulsing agitation of controlled fury, not the careful, assessing look of someone taking measure of a surprise. This was something else, something that looked at him and found him specifically worth looking at. "The court physicians," she said without preamble, "hold a rank of third circle within this household. Their recommendations carry formal weight before the court, their failures are recorded and reviewed, their successes are noted in the royal records." She paused, not for effect. She was not, he had come to understand, a person who paused for effect. She paused because she was organizing something precisely. "You have no rank, you carry no formal weight in this household. Your failures would have no formal record, and your departure would merit no official notation." "That's accurate, Your Highness," he said. "That changes today." The words landed quietly, but with the absolute solidity of things that have been decided, rather than considered things that have passed through the stage of deliberation, and come out the other side as settled fact. "You will be assigned to my household permanently. Not as a chamber servant, that position will be filled by someone whose primary qualification is maintaining chambers, which is a task you are capable of but not the most valuable thing you are capable of." She turned toward the window as she said this, and the morning light did extraordinary things to her recovered scales, running through the blue-black and finding depths in it that the past 11 days had made invisible, the iridescence that made dragon scales not merely colored but alive in the light. "You will be given a new designation, Inspector of Circumstances." A brief pause. "You will check the rooms." He blinked. He could not entirely help the blink. "That's," he started and then adjusted. "Is that an existing position, Your Highness?" The curl at the edge of her jaw was small and entirely controlled and unmistakably there. Not a full expression, not anything she would have allowed to be called a smile, but the physiological evidence of something that was choosing to be quiet about itself while still being present. "It is now." I am a princess of the Embercrown lineage of Korashan. I am heir to a throne that has stood for 400 years. When I make something, it is real. He absorbed this. The position will carry second circle standing in this household, she continued. You will have authority to examine any chamber, any corridor, any space connected to the royal quarters, and when the situation requires it, the broader palace without prior approval from household staff. Your findings will be reported directly to me, your failures will be recorded, your successes will be noted. She paused again. You will be compensated at a rate commensurate with second circle standing, which is considerably more than what a chamber servant receives and which will, I suspect, be less surprising to the Conclave's exchange program administrators than the title. He was quiet for a moment. He was aware that something was being offered that required receiving carefully, not with excessive gratitude, which would diminish it, and not with false modesty, which would be dishonest, and not with the particular performance of humility that people sometimes deploy when they have been given something they secretly believe they deserved, which was both dishonest and transparent. The physicians knew medicine, Valithra said, and her voice had changed again, not softer exactly, but carrying something more deliberate than the formal register of the appointment she had just made, something more direct. She looked at him with the full attention that she had fixed on him the morning before in the pre-dawn chamber with the lantern lit, but without the exhaustion behind it now, without the fraying edge. Just the attention itself, clear and complete. The healer knew spirit. The alchemist knew his compounds, the wizard knew his enchantments. They brought everything they knew into this room and examined me with it, and none of it was sufficient. A pause that was not long but had weight. You knew to get on your knees and look in the dark with a lantern. You knew the room. You knew that the room was part of the problem even before you knew what the problem was. She held his eyes with hers. That is not a small thing, Tamaz raised. Do not let anyone tell you that it is. He stood in the morning light in the amber-barred chamber and received this without looking away. I won't, he said, and meant it. The nest in the south garden wall flourished. This was noted later by several people who had reason to pay attention to such things. The palace groundskeepers, the natural historians who came occasionally to catalogue the flora and fauna of Korashan's palace complex, and eventually Tamaz himself, who checked on it periodically not out of sentimentality, but out of the same practical habit that made him check all the spaces he was responsible for. The thornweb spiders built their precise geometric architecture into the volcanic granite with the unhurried industry of creatures that have found what they need and intend to remain. They bothered no one. Their vibration, in the open air of the garden against the broad mass of the outer wall, dissipated before it reached anything that might be disturbed by it. They were, as it turned out, rather elegant when you looked at them in good light. The new position of Inspector of Circumstances was formally recorded in the Korashan Royal Household Register on the third day of the week following the affliction's end, in the careful notational hand of the senior chamberlain who had been hovering at the east corridor door during Valithra's 14 hours of recovery sleep. The entry was precise and unembellished, as the register's style required. The position's title, its standing, its holder, its duties. The chamberlain had paused for a moment over the duties section before writing, in the small, careful script of the register, what Valithra had described. Inspection of all chambers, corridors, and spaces connected to the royal quarters, direct reporting to the princess, authority to examine without prior approval. He had paused again, pen hovering, and then added a single clarifying note in the margin, which was technically outside the register's formal style but which he felt, given the circumstances, was warranted. Origin of position, the resolution of the 11-day affliction of HRH Valithra, Embercrown lineage. Commendation for service above rank noted. The court physicians were informed of the new appointment through the standard household communication channels. Vorok received his notification with equanimity and some private thoughtfulness. Saravith received hers while reviewing her own notes on the case, which she had been doing with the meticulous honesty of a practitioner genuinely interested in understanding where her methodology had failed, and she added a note to her records. Environmental assessment, not included in standard examination protocol. Review and revise. It was a small note. It resulted, over the following years, in a significant revision to the protocols used by specialists in high-lineage dragon medicine, which would have surprised Tamaz considerably if anyone had told him. Tollus the court wizard added a new diagnostic step to his enchantment sequence within the week, and did not tell anyone why. Years later, when the story made its way into the Conclave's diplomatic records, which it did, through the report of the exchange program's administrators who received Tamaz's updated posting with understandable interest, and then through the account he gave when he returned briefly to the Conclave's administrative center for his formal program review, and then through the various retellings that followed, it was always framed the same way. Not as the story of a servant who had gotten lucky, not as the story of a rare and unrepeatable coincidence, a man who happened to know about a particular spider because of a particular document in a particular collection that he happened to have read, Those framings were available and they were comfortable because they preserved the existing order of things. They made the outcome an anomaly rather than an indictment, a curiosity rather than a lesson. The conclave's archivists, to their considerable credit, declined those framings. They recorded it as the story of a system that had, in its thoroughness and expertise and elaborate investment in established methodology, failed to ask the question that preceded all methodology. What is actually in the room? They recorded it as a teaching example for exchange program participants. Not a lesson in any specific discipline, but a lesson in the posture that precedes discipline, the orientation toward a problem that makes expertise useful rather than limiting. The story was told to incoming participants in the Rooms and Circumstances section of their orientation, which had not previously existed as a section, and which was added directly as a result of this case. The entry in the records concluded with 3 questions, written in the archival hand of whoever had compiled the account, which were intended as prompts for reflection. Before examining the patient, have you examined the space? Before concluding the cause is internal, have you confirmed the external has been addressed? What is in the room that you have not yet looked at? These questions were asked in one form or another by practitioners and investigators and administrators across the conclave's territories for generations after the account was recorded. Most of them did not know where the questions came from. Some did, and made a point of knowing. Tamaz Reyes held the position of Inspector of Circumstances for 6 years in the direct service of Princess Valithra before the role expanded, as useful roles tend to, beyond its original scope. He was given a small staff at the end of the 2nd year, 2 junior inspectors trained in his methodology, which was not a formal methodology so much as an organized version of his mother's philosophy applied systematically to spaces of consequence. At the end of the 4th year, his authority was extended to the full palace complex, not merely the royal quarters. At the end of the 6th year, when Valithra was invested as full heir apparent and her household was reorganized accordingly, he was given a title that carried first circle standing and a brief that covered, in essence, all the spaces in Korashan that mattered. He kept the hand lantern. He had several made over the years to the same design, small, steady-burning, easily carried, with a clip for the belt. He gave them to his junior inspectors as a practical tool and as something more than a practical tool, which they all understood without needing it explained. He kept the clay jar too, not the original that had been returned to the supply stores after its use, but one like it, kept on the shelf of his office in the inspector's suite that he had eventually been given in the East Wing. He kept it, he told people who asked, because it reminded him that the resolution of large problems sometimes required small containers and a willingness to get onto a cold floor and look in the dark. Most people who heard this thought it was a metaphor. It was also entirely literal, which was, perhaps, the point. In Korashan, in the years of Tamaz Reyes' tenure, and in the years after, the inspection of spaces became a formal part of the palace's maintenance and health protocol, not in place of the physicians and healers and alchemists and wizards, all of whom continued their work, but alongside them, prior to them, as the first step rather than the last resort. It was not always necessary. Most of the time, the rooms were simply rooms. But sometimes, more often than anyone had previously assumed, the rooms contained something that mattered, something that lived in a dark corner, something that occupied space, something that had been present all along, waiting for someone to ask the right question and bring a lantern. They never did stop finding thornweb nests in places nobody had thought to look. And every time one was found, in the palace cellars, in the old stone of the East Library, behind the panels of the council chamber's interior walls, it was noted in the inspection records with the same quiet notation, in the style that Tamaz had established in his first formal report. Environmental anomaly, below floor-level visibility, resolved by relocation. And beneath that, always in the smaller marginal hand that he used for personal annotations, check the room first.